Hello and welcome. This is video number 2 in a three-part series about the Russian Revolution. In the previous video, we talked about the challenge of life in Russia, living under the Russian czars, and that there was an emergence of a revolutionary movement. One group in particular, the Bolsheviks, were led by a man named Lenin, and they were basically waiting for the right time, the right time to act. And that's what the subject of today's video will be. We'll be taking a look at two different times that the Bolsheviks thought that the time was right for revolution. One of those times would turn out not to be right. The other would turn out to be the movement that would change up the governing structure of Russia. So with that, we'll get started. All right, so the first time it seemed like the time might be right for revolution was in 1905. Now, it would turn out not to be the right time, but nevertheless, it's an important set of events for how things would play out in Russia moving forward. Now, the timing of what we know of or think of as the Revolution of 1905 was January 22nd, 1905. Basically, what happened is you had a group of about 200,000 workers and their families march to the Tsar's Winter Palace in the city of St. Petersburg. And as far as context goes, this would be kind of similar to here in America, a large group of people, 200,000 people, marching to the White House in peaceful protest is basically what that would amount to. And I think it is important to emphasize that this event that was taking place in St. Petersburg outside the Tsar's Winter Palace was, in fact, peaceful. It was objectively peaceful. That the kinds of things that the people were there asking for were improved working conditions, more personal freedoms, and they also wanted to have an elected national legislature. It's important to remember at this time in Russia, the Tsar ruled as an autocrat. It was an autocracy whereby the Tsar had total power. The people didn't have any kind of a specific or legitimate voice. They basically lived in Russia at the whim of the Tsar. And so what they were looking for in a national legislature would be something like the House of Representatives and the way it works in our own country here in America. Despite the fact that the march was peaceful, the Russian military was ordered to shoot the people. And as you can imagine, quite a few people were killed, quite a few more people were wounded, and the event ends up getting the name Bloody Sunday, appropriately so given the violence that ended up taking place when the people were shot. Now, what started out as Bloody Sunday in the city of St. Petersburg specifically would end up evolving into a series of uprisings that took place throughout Russia as word got around, not nearly as quickly as it would have today, but as word did get around to what had happened. It was upsetting to people in lots of places. And this put Tsar Nicholas II, who was the Tsar at this point in time, in a bit of an uncomfortable position. He being a person with total power, but at that point in time, having a lot of instability in Russia. And so to appease the people, to try to calm the people down and get the uprising and the violence to stop, he promised that there would be changes. And in fact, he started what was called the Duma, which was just simply the name for the Russian parliament or the legislative body that they had been asking for. He actually approved that to come into existence and to be a real and legitimate thing. So for the most part, things were able to settle down, and it appeared at that moment that changes were in fact happening. And so if you were an optimistic person at this point, you would have probably been feeling pretty good about where things were going. Unfortunately for the people, especially those that were really seeking some of these real changes, the Duma ended up being dissolved by the Tsar just 10 weeks later, and everything basically went back to normal. So it was really a kind of a hollow, false move on the part of the Tsar to bring about changes, and whatever did happen was very short-lived. And so this would turn out to be really, in terms of a revolutionary change moment, a non-event. It was a non-starter. Things didn't change. So as far as the Bolsheviks were concerned, as far as people like Lenin were concerned, this didn't turn out to be the time, but they would get their time. And that would end up coming through the revolution of 1917. Now, one of the biggest things that had changed by the time the revolution of 1917 takes place is World War I was happening. In fact, World War I was still happening when this revolution took place. And if you're familiar with World War I, or if you viewed any of the videos that I put out with World War I, you'll know that Russia struggled mightily in World War I, and that barely even halfway through the war, the people were really ready to be out of it. So conditions in Russia were probably about as bad as they had ever been when you get into 1917, as far as death and destruction and food shortages and disease and all kinds of nasty things that can come with being in a war. So as far as the revolution itself in 1917, it basically got started in March of 1917. Sometimes this is called the March Revolution. And it really began with women textile workers, so women clothing makers in the city of Petrograd or St. Petersburg, that they ended up leading a citywide strike. Now, this would ultimately evolve into just a full-on riot with people calling out for bread to eat and fuel to heat their homes. Basically, all the things that were going wrong became a part of this riotous movement because basically everybody had a shortage of the things that they needed for just basic survival. Now, soldiers were called upon to stop the rioting. So even though this was violent, whereas in 1905 that march wasn't, the reaction was still the same: have the soldiers stop the people from what they were doing. But the big difference here, and why things go a different direction here, is when the soldiers were called on to stop the rioting, they actually joined the people themselves. The conditions were bad enough that the soldiers refused to follow the order of the Tsar to stop what the people were doing. And so at this point in time, the Tsar realized that he had no one to support him. And that's an important thing to remember about any leader, whether it's somebody that's ruling with absolute power or really any other leadership position. When it comes to countries, at least, the military element is what can help a person in power maintain that power. If they lose that military element, they effectively become powerless. And that's where the Tsar found himself here in the spring of 1917. Now, again, this was Tsar Nicholas II at this point. He would, shortly after this, abdicate his throne or give up his power. And as it turns out, he and his family would eventually be executed about a year later. Now, it would turn out that with the Tsar stepping down, that unfortunately for Russia, there was no actual plan for what to do at that point. So the fact that the Tsar stepped out of the way didn't mean that all of a sudden everything was going to be fine. And so what ended up taking place was a provisional or a temporary government ended up being set up, and a guy by the name of Alexander Kerensky ended up being picked to lead it. And one of the things that he did early on in his time in this temporary role as a leader of Russia was elected to keep Russia in World War I. And that would end up really costing him some of the support that he initially had, because so many people in Russia at this time desperately wanted out of the war. Even though it might not be a good thing for the war effort itself, at this point in time, so many people in Russia didn't really care. They were concerned about themselves first and foremost and their country more than anything else. And so this really opened the door for a counter-revolution to end up taking place. And within Russia, one of the things that had started to develop were local groups of people that comprised of workers and peasants and soldiers, and they formed what were called Soviets. So the term Soviet itself just comes from the name given to local councils or local groups of people that would develop in major cities throughout Russia. And one of the things that would take place as these local groups started to meet is that they would prove to be more powerful than the actual provisional government that was in place at Russia at this point in time. And it's at this point that we see Lenin return to Russia, and we see the Bolsheviks see an opportunity to truly seize power in Russia. So this March Revolution, or this revolution of 1917, did serve to take the Tsar out of power and create the opportunity for a new government. But that temporary government will be in place a very short while, and we'll see a fight for control of Russia on the near horizon. And that'll be the subject of our third and final video in this series. Hopefully this video has been helpful and informative. Thanks for watching.